Right, I think we are on record. So, Owen, look, thanks for joining us on the MedTech Leaders podcast, where we speak to founders and leaders like yourself who can share a little bit about their journeys and their interesting insights for other aspiring people within the space. So, firstly, thank you for joining. And yeah, let's start off a little bit about your background and journey, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm Owen, one of the co-founders of ATDev, which stands for Assistive Technology Development. We are a medical device, robotics, and AI company, currently based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And yeah, we have a couple of different things we're working on, but they all fall in the category of mobility devices. So our first product is the Reflex device, which is a powered knee brace for doing at-home physical therapy. I'm a person with a disability, and I've used a wheelchair my whole life, and so I've really seen firsthand a lot of gaps in how medical rehabilitation technology is designed and distributed. So that's really what inspired me to start the company with actually my college roommate, Todd Roberts.
Okay, okay. So you were at college with your roommate, and essentially, when you said they inspired you, how do you mean? Did they kind of have the idea, or how do you mean?
Yeah, so yeah, Todd and I were roommates at UC Berkeley back in 2019. And I've my whole life have really been doing a lot of assistive technology projects, and I'd recently gotten a robotic arm, which you can see here uh, on my wheelchair, and I noticed that I was using it to do like basic range of motion and stretching exercises. And Todd was studying mechanical engineering and biomechanics with an emphasis on exoskeleton design. And we put our heads together and thought, hey, maybe we could develop a product that is robotic and specifically designed for doing physical therapy rather than building like a industrial exoskeleton or some sort of super soldier type of deal, but really focus on rehabilitation.
Sure, sure, sure. And I think you alluded to as well. Did you say that, for example, from your own personal circumstance as well, you've had like inspiration to kind of go in the space? Have you kind of always thought that way, or did that kind of just come after you spoke to your roommate? Did you always want to do something within this space?
Oh yeah, I've always been developing things and building things. My whole life. Even when you have medical devices that are you know custom and expensive and all of that, they really only get you 90% of what you need, especially for someone like me that has muscular dystrophy and a lot of complex needs. And so, my family and I, we've always been building things and coming up with inventions. And, one of the first things I built, which I was really proud of when I was a young kid, was a dog feeder dispenser so I could feed my dog independently. So, yeah, that's really been a big part of my life.
Wow. Okay. So always been like naturally quite, I guess, creative from a design and engineering perspective. Then I guess, right?
Yeah, I think, necessity is the mother of invention is very true in my case.
Awesome, awesome. Great. Well, let's go into a little bit about your company then. So, what have you been operating, did you say, since 2019?
We incorporated in 2020. Yep. So, yeah, just coming up on 6 years here, which is hard to believe. We started out as a class project with my, I mentioned, my college roommate and I. And then that turned into some early grant funding from the National Science Foundation, and ultimately we got an SBIR grant from the National Institute of Health. And then after that, we really started going down the venture capital path and raising more VC investor money, which has been, primarily what we've been doing now, although now we actually are generating some revenue with our reflex device, which has been on a limited market release for about a year now, and we're really, really excited about that. So, um, yeah, really did not did not think it would be, doing medical devices, 10 years ago, if you had asked me what I thought I'd be doing. But yeah, it's really, really rewarding work.
Yeah, yeah. When you say rewarding, do you like kind of enjoy the aspect that I guess building things that help people's lives, I guess, improve from a quality perspective? Is that how you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's really good to, build something that, helps people in their journey, rather than I don't know. I feel like a lot of, B2B SaaS or whatever it might be, while that's very, very useful, it's hard to, quantify the human impact of just, you know, numbers on a spreadsheet.
Mm.
So yeah, it's rewarding.
Yeah. I guess I'm going to ask you a really broad question now, and you can kind of answer it however you want. I guess 6 years in the journey now, what things do you think in particular are really important to get right in building a successful medical device company or company in general? What things would you say you've learned and if you look back on has been quite important?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think we did a lot of things right and we did a lot of things wrong also. I think particularly from a regulatory perspective, um, like most entrepreneurs and engineers, they come in with an idea for a solution and then, try to fit their regulatory pathway to their solution, um, which is, fine. But, it would have been very helpful and, saved us thousands and thousands of dollars to, have an earlier understanding of the regulatory pathways and how that all works. We're based in the United States, and so the FDA is pretty rigorous, which is good. You want to protect the consumer from bad actors, but there's definitely a lot of barriers for entrepreneurs who are in the space. So, um, yeah, I think a more holistic training for entrepreneurs in the regulatory space would be really helpful, especially in some accelerators or other programs that we went through. And other than that, I think one thing that was an unexpected barrier was some of the um, electromagnetic compatibility testing. And I think that goes back to, the regulatory, but we did not think it was going to be so hard to, get these seals of safety. And so we thought we had a final design, but we did not and had to, redesign our electronics more times than we care to admit.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting going. So if we unpack that a little bit, so obviously us at MG Regulatory, we operate a regulatory consultancy ourselves, and lots of founders say to us, we're not quite ready for regulatory yet. We're all fine. We're going to do that later. But you kind of mentioned there that you would have saved thousands had you incorporated it earlier. So why is that, Owen? Like, why? What's the issue in getting involved with regulatory later in the journey rather than from the beginning?
Yeah, well, there's just certain, structural decisions that you make when you're designing your device. And so, um, I'm not as familiar with how it works in the UK, but in the US, we have, different product codes that the FDA uses to classified devices, and the differences are, very subtle. What might be an upper arm exoskeleton could have a completely different product code than a lower body exoskeleton. Um, and so, when you're building something, you need to build for the end user, but ultimately you also have to build for the regulators as well, because they need to be able to, put their seal of approval on it. And so, yeah, I think it would have been helpful to having more general understanding of like how that worked earlier, so we could have made some decisions earlier.
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes sense. I guess, like, yeah, like, uh, it's such a regulated industry where, to your point, I think a lot of people have innovative ideas, and innovative products that they want to create, but what they don't realize is that with it being such a regulated industry, you need to ensure that everything you're doing is aligned to that, rather than going off on a journey and then you might have to retrospectively make adjustments due to the regulations, which is why I think
Yeah,
a lot of people lose
yeah,
both time and money, right?
yeah.
But
That's exactly it.
yeah. And I guess it's probably a natural thing to do, because I guess like a lot of entrepreneurs in the space are probably quite passionate about what they're doing, and they kind of have ideas and they want to kind of roll with it. And but yeah, you're always kind of at risk of perhaps going on a path which perhaps you're not quite allowed to do. The regulations don't permit you to do.
Right.
So
Yeah, and
yeah,
I think particularly now with AI, I'm sure basically every entrepreneur now is figuring out how to use AI to get an advantage, and the regulatory pathway for AI is like pretty strict, and
yeah,
probably for good reason. Again, it's for protecting consumers, but it's definitely an uphill battle for getting AI into medical devices. Um, and, I sit on some standards committees, like the Rehabilitation Society of North America, RESNA, and they work a lot with rehabilitation devices, so wheelchairs and exoskeletons and other things like that, and they set standards for how products are to be developed and how they're to be tested against. And AI has been part of the conversation for a few years now, but in order to get a new standard through one of these committees and ultimately governing consumer products takes years. I mean, 5 years is a pretty good benchmark, and so there's definitely going to be a delay in the innovation that we see. I think personally, from the advances of AI, before they're able to be commercialized in medical devices.
interesting. I guess like that'll be good to unpack a little bit. Like you said, Owen, lots of people are trying to incorporate AI in some way, shape, or form. Well, I'd say everyone with a business now is trying to incorporate it, like you said. If we take it from a medical device standpoint, what kind of I guess views and insights would you have for other medical device companies that are trying to incorporate AI? Have you got any views and opinions on it, in terms of what
Yeah.
they expect? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think AI has the potential to really help a lot of people, and make a lot of devices more intelligent. And I think it's a really, perfect example about what we were talking about earlier about really knowing what your regulatory pathway is. Because you could spend, millions of dollars developing the coolest new AI medical device. And if there isn't a regulatory pathway for that, you're not going to be able to sell it. And that's going to, burn time and money. So, yeah, again, I think that's another reason why I think it's important to engage with the regulations, earlier rather than later.
Makes a lot of sense. I think like if we discuss as well about fundraising, because I know you mentioned as well that you kind of have been through a journey with that, then eventually looked at getting venture capitalists on board. What's your? I guess lots of people will have a thing of like, oh, we've got a really good idea, we're just struggling to get funding. Have you got a view on the best way for a startup to kind of go about that, to give themselves the best chance to get funding and I guess keep growing?
Yeah. Well, yeah, funding is always hard. I think no matter what stage you're at. For us, what has really helped is, showing consistent traction, and engaging with investors that have even, said no in the past, following up with them 6, 12 months later and saying, yeah, since we talked last, we did X, Y, and Z things. And this is why we're, you know, even closer to the projections we had. Um, so yeah, it's definitely not easy. But continuing to, move forward and reach those milestones, that builds a lot of trust with your potential investors, and also just treating it like a relationship, and really building it over time. You're not just gonna meet someone randomly and they're gonna write you a check. You're gonna have to build trust, and they need to, build trust in you. You need to build trust in them. So, it really is a relationship, uh, more than anything, um, with those, technical and business milestones in there as well.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I guess a lot of people would overlook that side of things, right? In terms of actually getting people to trust you is a big part, right? If someone's going to invest in you, they probably are going to be looking at, do they trust you as an individual? So that relationship building side of things and getting to know people and showing who you are, I guess, is quite important as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think people can do that through social media or, other channels as well. Um, but, we've really focused on, building the relationships, in person as much as possible and making it, making it, mutually beneficial, right? That's what investors are looking for. They're definitely looking for a return on their capital, but I think particularly in the medtech space, they're also looking to be a part of something that's benefiting people in their health, and not just another B2B SaaS startup.
Yeah. What about in terms of when actually trying to convince people that about your idea? What things do you need to show, like in the terms of, is there any particular way you should try and present things or any particular things you should focus on? Because I guess there's so many different things you can talk about, right? Some people might get talk a lot about just the product itself. Some people might talk about the numbers and the returns and uh, what things should people people focus on to give themselves the best chance.
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, and I think it depends on, every product, every business is different. So it is, dependent on what are the key metrics for your particular case. Um, but I guess high level, people talk a lot about the, TAM, SAM, and SOM, the total addressable market, serviceable addressable market, and operable market. Trying to give your audience an idea about, how big of a market this is, how, best case scenario, how many people, are going to need this. And so that's helpful to kind of, we give a 30,000 foot view of the, market that you're operating in. Um, but I think it's also those numbers can be misleading, because it's really, really difficult to sum up a market in those sizes. Um, a lot of startups that are new, say, yeah, and then we're going to capture 1%. of this market, and that's going to be $100 million. But I think there's a lot of pushback on that because it's like that's just completely a arbitrary percentage. It doesn't say how you're going to get there, what you need to get there. Um, so what we found was for us was really focusing on statistics that are publicly available. So there's 1.3 million knee surgeries, knee replacements performed in the U.S. every year. That's a number that we draw from Medicaid or Medicare data that's publicly available. And so that's like a really hard data point that investors can verify. And so, when we come with that type of data, it's much easier to build a narrative around, how many physical therapist visits there are for each of those surgeries. What's the average price of one of those PT visits, and how much time does that cost, the clinician and the patient, and what would the potential, savings of that be for a, different robotic telehealth visit. And so really telling the story through data is what has worked for us.
Really, really interesting. Yeah, such a good point. I think a lot of people do go about the kind of route of, oh, if we just get 1% of the market, it'll be this much. But like I said, but how, right?
Yeah,
The how bit, actually going into the details, and I guess having some kind of evidence to back your claims, right?
yeah, yeah. And VCs are smart. Most of them. Definitely not all of them, but most of them are have a background in finance or, now nowadays computer science or something like that. And so, they think a certain way. And so, if you can tell your story in a way that makes sense to their, right brain or left brain, whatever, logical brain, that really helps a lot.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And why? And I'm going to ask you another broad question. Like, why do you think so many medtech companies actually fail? Like, what do you think would be some of the main reasons?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, I think one is regulatory. It took us 5 years to see our first dollar in actual revenue that wasn't from a grant or an investor. And so, in order to be able to sustain a team for that long, um, you got to be willing to eat some ramen and not go on vacation, um, which for some people is fine, if you're young and um, but for a lot of other people that are more established in their career, it's like not really a sacrifice that they're willing to make. And um, also it is a niche investment area. Um, again, 5 years to first revenue is a lot different than 6 months to 1 million in ARR if you're a software company. Um, so there's definitely downward pressure from there. For investors that are purely profit focused. Um, it might not make the most sense to invest in medical devices. But at the same time, and at ATDev, we always really believe that, um, the world doesn't really need another delivery app. The world needs devices that are going to, save people's lives or help people live more independently. Um, and so, it's a different type of return that you get as well as financial. Um, so I know we're veering a little bit away from your question, but yeah, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, interesting. I guess if we just unpack the first thing you said, so it took you 5 years to get your first dollar. Now, Do you think, just discussing that some people fail, but they've not failed yet? So what I mean is that they're expecting things to happen sooner or easier than they should happen within the medical device space. So do you think that I'm just running a hypothesis by you there? Do you think that happens where people get a little bit into the journey and think that, oh, this really isn't working, when actually they're just not being patient enough? Do you
Oh
think
yeah,
that's happening in some
yeah,
cases?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely part of it. They talk a lot about the valley of death in startups, where you start with some funding, and then reality sets in, and you realize how much work you have to do before you are going to make anything. And most startups end or die in that valley of death. But if you can make it to the other side where you are generating revenue and meeting some of those metrics, um, hopefully you're on the other side of that valley. So um, yeah, that's definitely part of it.
It's interesting. I guess as well, if we then bring it back to a tangible, the tangible there, if you're going to have a long period of not generating revenue and you need to be patient, I guess you got to really keep an eye on your burn rate, right?
Yes.
To just survive. So, what do you think medtech companies are investing into things which they can avoid potentially? I'm asking a really generalized question. For example, like I'm trying to get your advice on what you think people might be doing where they're burning more money than they should be. Like
Yeah.
anything that you think that generally is happening.
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe I'll start with something that's worked well for us. One of the things that we did, um, I think really helped our credibility as first time founders was building partnerships with other existing institutions like UCLA, UC Health in Colorado, um, UC Health, or UCSF, a lot of these big hospital chains, and running pilots with them. That really helps when you're talking to an investor to say, yeah, we've gotten external validation from physicians that work in this field every day. Um, and similarly, letters of intent are really helpful. Getting letters signed by physical therapists saying that, yeah, if this product was available, this would save them, X amount of hours a week that they could then use to, do other things. And then bring that and say, yeah, we have 100 physical therapists that have signed a letter saying that they want this. And that really shows market readiness. Um, so, honestly, I think one thing, and, maybe this is the marketer in me saying it, but I think that, early on, it's more important to build relationships and have those um, data points that you can show than to actually have a physical device. Because, approaching this as engineers, we know that we can build, the product. We know that we can eventually, given enough money and time, build something that works, but it's a lot harder to validate the market. And so, I think I'd probably spend more time validating the market than actually building the product, which is maybe a hot take, but yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember doing one of these episodes with another founder, and they kind of said something to me, which isn't exactly what you said, but I kind of think it mirrors where once they got funding, they put lots of it into product development. When they look back, they shouldn't have done that. They should have put more into validation and regulatory,
Yeah,
because essentially you end up going down a path which might not be the path that the market is saying. And he kind of gave a good example as well of where you start adding things into your product, which actually it makes it more expensive, but it doesn't add enough value for the market to actually want it, which was quite
Right.
interesting. So he said something like 90% of devices, in his opinion, are over engineered. So I guess that's another risk, right? If you're not talking to the market enough, you could be over engineering and overbuilding something and ultimately make things more difficult for you later down the line, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, engineers love to engineer, and it's easy to, sit in your workshop and build stuff and feel like you're making a lot of progress when, ultimately that might not even be what people want. So doing as much customer discovery as early on is really what I would recommend. Getting out of the building and talking to, everyone in the ecosystem that has to approve your product. And I think one of the things that's challenging about medical devices is that the ecosystem is very complicated.
Yeah.
The end user, the person who uses the device, isn't the person who pays for it. They're not even the person that prescribes it. And so you have to have buy off from, I mean, sometimes 10 people or 10 titles in order to actually get something into the patient's hands. And your device has to, check the box for each one of those people, including the end user. Um, and so that's not easy to do. If you're just selling, uh, socks or whatever
Yeah.
direct to the consumer, you only need to make one person happy. But medical devices, you have insurance, physicians, value analysis committees, um, and the patient has to want to use it too. And if any one of those entities isn't happy with it, your product isn't going to be successful. And so, really having an understanding of what those check marks are for each entity is really going to be helpful as you do your engineering.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So if we take an example for you, what things, because if we look at it like this, right? If you haven't even quite got your product there, it's not as easy as just being able to take your product and show people. You're going to have to talk to people maybe without a product. So what questions do you ask to really get the good market insight, if you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What things do you try and ask to?
Well, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. One recommendation that we got from some of our advisors is to specifically not talk about your product at all until the very end of the interview. Ask them questions that are, meaningful to you, but don't talk at all about, you know, what your product does because once you start getting into features and, yada, 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 then you're having a very different conversation and you're biasing how the person might respond to something. So, for us, we took that advice in a lot of our interviews and found it to be helpful where, we could ask physical therapists, how much time do you spend writing documentation every week? And they're like, well, sometimes it's like 15 hours a week. And it's like, wow, that's really a lot of your time. And then do you wish that you could spend that time actually doing anything else? And they're like, yeah, resounding yes. Um, and, that got us a lot of insight without having to talk about our product at all, which, had we started with us, it's really everyone wants to be pleasing and say that you have a good idea. Whereas if they don't even know what your idea is, you're going to get a more unbiased response.
Very interesting. I think that's really useful advice, isn't it? Because the temptation would always be to talk about your product, isn't it? Like as an instinct, you think you
Yeah,
want to talk about it, find out. But it's super interesting actually. The more you do that, the more narrow and like you're going to start biasing that whole conversation, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not saying that's the right approach for everyone, and I mean certainly, if you have um, like a real busy person that doesn't have a lot of time, and you know, you obviously know that they understand the problem that you're trying to solve. You don't need to waste their time by playing games with them, but um for I think just a broad audience, and we found that really helpful.
Yeah. What would you say in your kind of journey has been like? Is there any particular challenge that springs to mind in particular that was very difficult to overcome in this 6-year journey, or not any?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't know if we have enough time for all of those.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe one that particularly springs to mind. Is there any
Yeah.
in particular that really?
Um, yeah, well, I think we talked about it a little bit already, but gaining trust from clinicians is equally as important and challenging as gaining trust from investors. And so, developing a medical device, like we talked about earlier, you need buy off from clinicians, and they're really hard to get in touch with. Um, they're hard to find. You're so busy, and even if they're the perfect fit and they would agree with everything that you're doing, just getting a hold of them is like really challenging. And so that's always a problem is, finding the right person in the hospital or, whatever institution you're trying to get into. Um, there's so much back channeling and, finding a friend of a friend and, taking people out to lunch or dinner just for a, 10-minute conversation. That's, a big business development challenge that is, ongoing and, yeah.
Really interesting. You mentioned earlier as well that having partnerships has been quite useful. Do you mean, do you mind elaborating on that a little bit more in terms of what those partnerships have been able to do for you in particular that you would have struggled to do by yourself?
Yeah, so we got a grant through the National Institute of Health, the NIH, um, here in the U.S. to do a study with UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, in their athletic department. So we got to work with the head team physician for the LA Lakers, as well as professors and biomechanics at UCLA, and have a lot of student athletes try our device. So, that's a particular example of a government funded research study that, we're able to put all of their logos on our pitch deck, but also we're able to collect data from patients and actual, real life uses of our device, which again feeds into our pitch deck saying, yeah, people have used our device for, X amount of minutes and done X amount of exercises. And so, the data is equally as valuable as the marketing assets to be able to put logos on and say we're working with a famous doctor and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And how do you find that more from a mental and emotional perspective? What I mean is that, and correct me if this isn't the truth, but if you're building a company, particularly in MedTech, where you're quite passionate about the product and the cause from scratch, you probably almost naturally, I would thought, want to have a lot of, I guess, control over the whole thing. But then you probably come to that journey and realize that actually to make it work, like you said, in such a complex space, it's hard to do completely by yourself. You need to involve lots of
Yeah.
other people. do you am I overplaying that, or is that true that it's a little bit of kind of a conflict slightly, or for
Oh
you was
yeah,
it straightforward? Like,
yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Um, yeah, it's definitely difficult when you get a lot of people that are passionate about an idea into a room, and everyone has what they think should happen, and yeah, it's definitely challenging, and I think also, predominantly men as well. I would love to see some more, gender diversity in the field. I think that could probably help. But yeah, it is difficult to, balance that need to, I want to see your idea be the one that's chosen to move forward. But at the same day too, I think there's just so much to do that eventually you just kind of are so tired that you need you need to admit that you need some help to get the thing over the finish line, even if it's not exactly what you imagined.
yeah, yeah. How's um how's it been having a co-founder in the journey? Do you think that that's helped significantly, and if so, in what kind of ways?
Yeah, well, I feel really fortunate. My co-founder, Todd Roberts, and I, we have a really, really wonderful relationship, and we trust each other a lot and respect each other. And so, yeah, we've been really fortunate to um, have a good working relationship and personal relationship, and generally 9 times out of 10 we're on the same page with what we think we should do. Um, and so, for me, it's been really helpful to have a friend in the journey because, entrepreneurship is it can be quite isolating and quite lonely, and it's hard to, explain to a random person or, even a significant other, the challenges that you're facing and, how difficult it is. So it's nice to have someone who knows the score and knows what you're going through. Um, and a lot of people don't have that, whether they don't have a co-founder or simply co-founder breakups happen all the time, and they can be really ugly. And so it's important to build those expectations early on as to what that relationship is going to look like, so you don't end up in a real mess.
Yeah. That's probably for a whole nother episode we could talk about. But I
Yes.
feel that, yeah, I feel that the emotional side of it is actually, I think, like everyone talks about things like, okay, like R&D, product development, market research, all of the things that need to be done. But actually, like for example, you said if it takes and you're in like 5 years to make the first dollar, in that 5 years, you're going to be running through so many different emotions and doubts and right,
Yep.
and it's such a roller coaster. And I think that what can end up making a company fail is just your own durability, right? To deal with that
Mhm.
mental pressure and stress, right? It's so much to deal with. So having someone on that journey perhaps makes you, I guess it gives you a bit more engine to keep going, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Absolutely. Look, I've taken a lot of your time, and it's been super interesting chat. We could talk about so many things, but I'd
Yeah.
last probably just ask you: is there any last bits of words of wisdom you wanted to share with other people within the space that are still going and trying to, I guess, aspire to make something good?
Yeah. Well, I think if you have an idea that you might want to do something, whether that's building a device for yourself or a friend or a loved one, um, there's there's so many unmet needs in healthcare, and particularly with robotics and AI, and just general technology where we're at now. There's also so much opportunity for what wasn't even possible like 3, 5 years ago. is possible now. And so, if you think you have an idea and it might help someone, pursue it. It's, well worth it.
Awesome. No, look, I mean, it's been brilliant chatting to you, and you shared some really, really interesting perspectives, which I'm sure people will get a lot of use from. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me on. I hope I wasn't too boring.
No, no, really interesting, really interesting. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.